AI for many years has been basically primarily implemented within pilots or POCs, so not really at scale. And therefore, this question were not really addressed properly. When you just do a POC with a few users, not coming into production, it's not necessarily something you are looking at. But now that more and more projects are going at scale, banks are starting to really question the impact on these solutions, on their ethics, on how does that connect with their value? Is it good or bad? Can they do it or not? So today I'm going to try to give you a sense of the types of problems that are posed by AI in risk management, and also try to give you some insights on the types of solution that we can use. So I'm not gonna give you answers or tell you what is right or wrong. I think right now we are at the stage where the most important is really to ask the right questions. So I will get you through a few scenarios just to give you a sense of the types of situations where AI can bring people responsible in risk within banks, as well as people who are implementing AI in these areas. So first example, you are the chief investment officer of an investment bank. The head of AI comes and see you and mention that he has a friend on Instagram who is the CEO of a scale-up where the bank is investing. He says that he noticed in the past few months his lifestyle changed. For instance, he moved to a smaller house, he stopped traveling and so on. And these are predictors that basically he has less money available, and this could potentially be a predictor that his company is not doing very well. So this is what he's suspecting. So he tells you, if you want, I can build a model that will use this data with your clients, use these sources to try to identify which client may be in trouble where you are invested or investing. So it can basically correlate these life events with the performance of their business. So you are the chief investment officer. What would you tell him? Shall he do it or not? No, I will leave it as a rhetorical question. In another example, you are the head of private banking in a Swiss bank. The head of AI comes and see you, and he wants to discuss how to manage sentiment analysis for politically exposed people. So politically exposed people are normally tracked within private banks by teams to see if there is a reputational risk in working with them. Obviously, if these people get into some form of trouble, especially very visible trouble across the media, the banks might take action to distantiate from them. So he's basically telling you that his current model is detecting the trend very effectively. However, the model relies on public sources, so it includes things like tabloids with sources that are not very reliable. And right now, basically the information is delivered to a relationship manager, and they can decide what to do with the client. He tells you that now he can build a model that would be more prescriptive. So basically, not only informing the relationship manager that something goes wrong with this client, and when we say something goes wrong, that means if you are talking of politically exposed people in, let's say, in Latin America, in China, in Eastern Europe, where this trouble can lead up to this person going to jail, for instance. So he is basically asking you if you want to have a model that is more prescriptive, so telling you what to do on advising a bit more firmly the relationship manager to change the relationship or even completely quit the relationship with this client. So what would be his answer to him? And in a third scenario, you are the head of data science in a retail bank. the CEO pops up in your office, and he has read in the newspaper that in the US, loan applicants of color are 40 to 80% more likely to be denied their loan than their white counterparts. So he wants, the bank is in Europe, but he wants to make sure that all the clients are treated equally and fairly. On the other hand, he's a business person, so he also wants to make sure that the risk of the bank is probably mitigated. He wants to avoid false negative, and he wants to make sure that people don't default, whatever their background. So he also tells you that he's not a data scientist, he's a banker, so he doesn't really understand how that works. How would you explain to him how that works? So you see these three examples, and it's all rhetorical questions to highlight a bit the types of problems that both on the business side and also on the AI and technology side, the types of questions that you are asked. And the point is not really to answer this question. The point is really to know what do you need to answer these questions. And there are a number of things you can use within company governance. So for instance, the mission, if your mission is create a better world, it's probably not going to be the same answers as if your company motto is let's maximize the shareholder return. And if within your company core value, you have things like trust, like reliability, the answers might be like transparency, for instance. The answers might also be a little bit different. So in order to answer these questions, it is very important that company provide their employees, both in AI and technology, but as well in the business, with guidance. So some of the guidance are at corporate level, so like strategy, mission, vision, and so on. Also, there are ethical frameworks, but these frameworks need to be applied more specifically to AI, and especially AI and risk. I will now give you an example of how Cognizant is actually addressing responsible AI. So first, one of the key areas we are looking at is the benefits that we can provide to people and communities. So, and these are all actually guidelines that are provided to our developers, to our data scientists, to make sure that they have a beacon to understand what they can do and cannot do, or make a judgment in terms of what is right or wrong in terms of what they develop. So the first area is around benefiting people and communities. So it's not only about supporting business, even though it's obviously also about that, but we also want to have an impact on people and communities. So there are a number of companies that are now shifting more towards a stakeholder model versus shareholder models. There are a number of examples. Salesforce, for instance, is a good example. When they build their new headquarters in San Francisco, they also build part of a station. They built a space that could be used by the public below the building and so on. So, the company is not only made for the shareholders, but also for all the communities that live around it. So when you apply this to risk management, the question you would ask are typically, how does the risk assessment benefit the customer and the community? So are you only looking at protecting your bank, so making sure the client doesn't default whatsoever, and of course that should be a clear priority, but also how does it address other purposes to cover the benefit from the customer and from the community? And obviously that changed quite a lot depending on what kind of business you do, right? If you are, for instance, bank or loan company that specifically address some communities, you would obviously manage your algorithm in a different way than if you're only trying to. Another topic we are looking at is around privacy and boundaries. So we want to make sure that the users or the clients have a very clear picture of what we get from them. We want really to make sure that they fully consent to the information they share. We also want to make sure that this is transparent so that they can remove any consent at any time. So in the case of risk management, and that relates to the first example I was mentioning, for instance, with social media, we would, for instance, ask an explicit consent to the client to share the information, and we will not use this information without telling him explicitly. Another principle we are using is the design for transparency, and that's where we basically think everything should be explainable. And developers should be able to explain whatever they are producing to people, even if they don't have in-depth technology background. So that's normally fairly easy if you have a relatively simple model that is standalone. If you have multiple models embedded, it can get more complicated. So you still have to keep the overall picture end-to-end of what the model is, the models or the groups of models are producing, on what are basically the effects on the actors that are impacted. So yeah, we want to make sure all the actors understand really what the models are doing. The other principle we are looking at is addressing inequality and minimize bias. So here, for instance, the way it would be applied in risk management, and that's a typical example in the risk management, bias, especially around communities. So the question is, do we how are we assessing this bias and these inequalities? Do we for instance, simulate for different community the impact on model? Obviously, depending on the, how you set it up, the parameters you put in, it might have very different effects. So how can we measure the effect on a number of communities? Can we do it also on an ongoing manner, not just at one point, or make sure we have systems in place that monitor the model and make sure that we sort of stay on track within the boundaries that we have fixed to keep to minimize the bias and keep the models fair. So that's, for instance, something we will do. The other key principle is around enabling participation. And that's actually a very good way of mitigating risk, because instead of having teams that work pretty much standalone, can do their stuff on their own, we enable everybody who is involved in the project to look at what is being done, and that may help to raise questions that will detect some risk and make sure that this is corrected. So people are really encouraged to bring up ethical practices and to flag actually things that they do not think right, and then there are discussion within teams to make sure that this is working. So that's the kind of principle we are applying, and that's an example, but the question is, how do you put them into practice? So we have basically three pillars. One is the governance. So how do you govern actually these projects? So you need a program and project management in place. You need a constant risk assessment and mitigation. You need to have accountability. You need to have a line of escalations. You need to have transparency. So all these needs to be in place. In terms of architecting, we have also principles. Some of them have been touching briefly around how you want to build the solutions. So it needs to be human-centered, it needs to be explainable, and then we want also to be able to monitor these all the solutions we are looking at, because the bias sometimes build up with time. So we have to make sure that this is constantly in track. But what is very important is that AI is not standalone in the company. On responsible AI, ethics in AI comes together within a much broader framework within banks and companies on really needs to be connected. So there are key areas that you see in the bottom of the slides. All these areas have an impact on ethics, on responsible AI. A few I could pick, for instance, legal and regulatory. So there is a new EU regulation around AI systems that actually classify the system into unacceptable high risk, medium risk, low risk, depending on the types of data you use. For instance, you wouldn't use biometrics data. Also looking at bias. ESG is typically the framework that is used within banks to oversee all these practices. This also needs to be very strongly aligned with the values that are pushed there across the bank, on making sure that you have a consistency. Organizational change management is also critical, because all these topics, being new, have to be brought to the decision makers on typically do not have a strong education or a strong view on it. So it takes usually time to make sure that people understand. It first takes time for them to embrace AI, but ethics in AI, even more time and even more effort to make sure that all the decision makers are aligned. And then there are a number of other things that I will not go through because it is running a bit out of time. So in terms of why should you do it and what does it bring to the company, I think first of all it's a shift of value. So what are your company values? And more companies are embracing ESG, are embracing conscious capitalism and so on the stakeholder theory or this kind of topics. So the question is, how fast are these paradigms moving inside the company? And they may not have. I mean, some company can still work in the, let's say, old school model without any problem, and that's probably okay. But the question is, what does that bring, to be responsible AI? And there are a number of benefits around brand building, especially around customer experience, around trust with customers, which in the long term is creating profitability. There are also strong impact on employee experience, also on recruitment, on the retaining staff, because more and more employees now want to see these values being really in place in their employer, and some of them will probably choose an employer based on these principles and values. So yeah, this is in short what I wanted to tell you. I've been a bit longer, I think, than planned. Is there any questions? Happy to answer anything.
Thank you very much, Luc. Very, very interesting presentation. I do have a few questions. From your experience, what is the maturity on this topic if you compare financial institutions Switzerland compared to outside Switzerland or US, given that Cognizant is a US company?
Yeah, well, it's a US company, but we have also a strong presence in Switzerland and Europe. So we work really on both sides. So the maturity difference are huge. Quite honestly, they are huge in AI overall. We see, for instance, in the US, and even within the same banks, the US teams moving really much faster than Europe, having already some cloud environment ready, being able to do AI at scale, implementing AI at scale, using also ML ops, so these kind of things. While some banks, or the same team of the banks in Europe, are much slower, still, trying to get things moving, aligning the stakeholders, making sure they have the right people in place. So there are big differences in AI. On that obviously implies that there are big differences also in responsible AI, because as I say, as long as you don't implement AI at scale, the ethical problem are not a major priority. Typically, a company will not look at it significantly proactively until it's really at scale implemented with their customers. That's probably not a good practice. Typically, they should do it and have some framework and some thinking beforehand. But in practice, typically you look at it when you really start to do it for real. So yeah, that's our view on the situation.
Mm-hmm. And who is the driving force, or who is the catalyst for this topic, in your opinion?
Well, it's typically a journey that the company is taking. So, of course, the senior management and the CEO have to bring a very strong impact. We've seen in the financial services some CEOs giving very strong signals. So, for instance, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, I think 2 years ago, this ESG manifesto, so saying the companies he wants to invest in or not, on how much company he wants to invest in should have an ESG governance in place. We've seen also Goldman Sachs claiming they would only do IPO for companies who have, I think, 1 or 2, I can't remember. I think they want to increase women on their board. So these are very strong signals. But these signals come typically when the company is mature enough. It's not the CEO saying top down, this is going to happen like that. It is that the CEO sense that the company is mature enough. It's a very iterative process where the senior management on the team are basically progressing together. On some are probably pushing more than others. I've seen also banks where junior staff were pushing extremely strong for ESG. Or responsible AI, on the senior management didn't really care. So the dynamics can be very different, but overall it's really a transformational journey where the whole company needs to get moving. And that takes a bit of time. By the way, that might explain also a bit the difference between the US and Europe, where Europe is typically a bit more stiff. The US, typically able to move a little bit more boldly.
Mm-hmm. Good. And the ultimate risk, if companies don't embark on this journey, how can you say something about it?
Yes. Well, the risk it depends really how you see it. A lot of companies right now are working on these areas primarily on a defensive basis. So on primarily preventing some reputational risk, and that's actually probably the biggest risk. There are numbers that show that a company who face ESG controversy see their market valuation drop by up to 30% within 1 to 2 years. So there are definitely financial impact on reputational issues that companies are facing. So a lot of companies are really working on this basis. Typically, so there's a lot also of what we call greenwashing and so on. So some of these topics are managed by communication or PR department in some cases, which is probably not what I would recommend. So on the other end of the spectrum, some companies are truly embracing these values and these practices. And that's where, this dynamic should come. And that's a bit the dynamic I was explaining, between the staff, the senior management, people getting more and more aware that these are the things that are good to be done. And these are the model, the company, and the values the company want to live from. So, yeah, the risk right now is a lot around reputation. But business is never far. For instance, if you look at the example I was mentioning with Goldman Sachs, you also find out that the IPO of companies who have several women on their board are actually much more profitable than those who don't. So in a way, it's also an indicator of how much the company is able to embrace the new paradigm, and get to the next generation. And therefore, they are also more successful because they are not only able to adapt, to the ESG and to the new models we see in terms of sustainability, and so on, but also on digital, on all the trends that make future business successful. So they are also, in many cases, it's very ambiguous, but let's say the new world is probably coming up that way. And now many companies are basically embracing it. Not embracing it is basically a risk to miss the train.
Yeah. Will be interesting to see in a year, 2 years' time where we are on
Absolutely.
this topic. Definitely,
it's evolving. It's evolving extremely fast. even 2 years ago, we probably wouldn't have talked too much about that. On AI was still, a stronghold, or maybe not 2 years, but 5 years or 4 years, it was still a stronghold of data scientists. Right now, it's really spreading in the company, which is great. I did the journey from AI being in the research stage to now coming at scale. But of course, it's posing a lot of questions in terms of operationalization, and also the impact that this is all bringing.